Welcome to the program. Well, the first news poll of the year has been an eagerly anticipated one, of course, because usually the quiet summer, the political free zone has not been the case this year, with the bushfire crisis well and truly putting the spotlight in particular on Scott Morrison. And that has played out in the opinion polls. We'll take a look at those figures now. First of all, on the primary vote, and you can see in terms of the parties an impact here, but not a huge one. The Coalition 40% down to Labor up 3%, so that's making some pretty solid ground there. Two-party preferred, it does play out to some pretty significant numbers. The government going from a pretty comfortable lead, 52-48, as you can see, shifting 3, now trailing 49-51. Hardly a disaster this far out from the next election, but not the way you want to spend your summer, giving up that lead in the polls. It's where it plays out on preferred Prime Minister that really shows how much wrath has been directed towards Scott Morrison, losing 9% there in preferred PM. That is a huge tumble down. In terms of approval rating as well, Scott Morrison will be concerned about how much bark he's lost here. Those figures showing that it's a case of, well, reasonably popular before, at least going towards neutral territory, and now that figure right down to 37%. I'm not sure if we have the next one for you. Anyway, trust me on that, Scott Morrison losing a similar amount of ground there. You can see it, 37%. So part of the reaction, of course, to the bushfire crisis was the image of Scott Morrison going into the town of Cobargo, which was hit very hard. The locals were giving it to him. He was criticised because he didn't seem to want to take it. The first woman he spoke to, once she moved on to, well, not throwing abuse at him, but certainly very vocally critical of Scott Morrison. He essentially forced her to shake his hand and then moved on. What's the best approach in that situation? Perhaps this one from Josh Frydenberg. He was bailed up by a voter for several minutes, and eventually the voter left seemingly pleased with the interaction.
The country's burning, climate change is resulting in unprecedented amounts of fires. It's 0.1% of what's going towards the naval fleet to defend our nation.
Well, there's an enormous amount of money that is going into the bushfire response, and there'll be more money that will be going in as well.
The internet and influencers from around the world crowdfunded over $80 million. That's more than 30% more than the government's initial investment. You said it doesn't matter the cost for the government. Why is it taking people from around the world to empty their pockets to put money into the bushfire relief when the government can't even match that figure?
The focus is not only on habitat restoration and wildlife protection, mental health support, small business support, support for the volunteer firefighters. Thank you. Thank you.
Shake of the hands and off they went. Joining me for more on this, the poll situation and the political fallout, our political editor Andrew Clennell. Andrew, look, perhaps a bit of a lesson on how to do things. We should stress this was Port Macquarie. I'm not sure of the background of the young man there, but we know the situation in Cobargo. Most of the town had just been razed, so tempers were running a bit hotter then.
Yeah, that's right, and I'll bet you, over the past month, or especially couple of weeks, Scott Morrison has done a lot of thinking about how he can handle some of these situations better. And there's certainly a fair bit of surprise around the place that he hasn't handled them better given his experience. And Frydenberg is also experienced. He's come across difficult people and he shows how it's done there. Even the Cobargo visit, not advanced, no contact with Andrew Constance. They could have sorted out what sort of crowd he was going to get, etc. So it's kind of a Prime Minister's office learning on the job, I guess, which is a bit alarming. But I guess in terms of this news poll, Tom, it's not today that matters or the poll that matters. It's what happens from here that matters. It's how Scott Morrison and his team react from here, and perhaps it's the kick in the backside that the Prime Minister needed. And I'm sure he'll have that result in his mind as he pushes forward and looks to continue to deal with this crisis and the recovery. Let's hear what Josh Frydenberg had to say about a phone call he had with Scott Morrison today about the poll and the recovery.
The Australian public know that Scott Morrison is absolutely focused on delivering for them, delivering the response and recovery that is required. That's where Scott Morrison's focus is on. I spoke to him this morning. We're in regular contact every day. The colleagues are very much focused on ensuring that the community gets the support. It's not about what it costs, it's about whatever it takes.
And that's the message Scott Morrison wants to continue to hammer I'm not worried about polls, I'm not worried about the noise, the distraction, I'm worried about the recovery effort, and whatever it costs. Surplus out the window almost. I'm not sure if Josh Frydenberg was biting down hard when he was saying those words, but the thing is today we've had a bit of a pile-on the PM, as you'd expect, off the back of a 59% disapproval rating, which is staggering, and one of those piling on was Pauline Hanson. Let's listen to that.
I'm actually disappointed with him myself. When he was Immigration Minister, I predicted then that he would actually go on to be Prime Minister of this country, and I've been dismally disappointed with him. He's not the strong leader that he was then. I feel that a lot of the time he's fence-sitting. If you're going to have a Royal Commission into it, throw bloody climate change out the window and let's look at the pure facts of why we have had the bushfires.
There she goes, Miss Hanson. Now let's have a listen to another person on the pylon, Richard Marles.
You know, this is a Prime Minister who has not been engaging in leadership. This is an engagement in panic. And it's not panic on behalf of the nation, it's panic on the part of Scott Morrison himself. Panic about his image, panic about his level of support, panic about his standing in the community.
Andrew, you've been speaking to a few of the coalition MPs, of course, for their real thoughts about the polls, because we get something pretty varnished when they get asked on camera, of course. It's interesting. I don't think anyone over the holiday break thought that everything Scott Morrison did was great, but that they weren't going for him. What was your reaction? What were you picking up this morning speaking to these MPs? Yeah,
I've spoken to a few MPs. One MP said, you've got to stay humble if you want to survive. That's that person's advice to Scott Morrison. Pretty pointed there. Another one says it's pretty bad for us. The government stocks usually improve in the summer, and that hasn't occurred here. But it's not a fatal blow. Well, I should think not after one poll, but it just shows how down people are about it. And yet another says, I don't think people should be panicking. Long way to go. With the speculation around the place that out of the Royal Commission, particularly for some moderate Liberals, there could be an opportunity for an independent person to suggest the government go further on climate change and on emissions without Morrison having to tick off his own colleagues in doing so. So anyway, someone who was up this morning and defending, someone from the party room who hasn't always been happy of late, who was defending Scott Morrison this morning, was Barnaby Joyce. Let's listen to that.
There is a part of taking your medicine. We understand clearly that the Prime Minister said himself that there's parts that he could have done better, and that's it. If you don't acknowledge your fault, then you're making a mockery of the people who have concerns. The poll is unsurprising, but it'll move on. And as I just mentioned earlier, that whole climate change issue just doesn't seem to go away. Again, you saw with Pauline Hanson, the pressure Scott Morrison's under to do nothing. He won 24 of 30 seats in Queensland, needs to hang on to those seats, two-seat majority. Let's hear what the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, who's in a much different state politically, Victoria, had to say about the climate change issue and the government's approach just in the last hour.
The Prime Minister yesterday used the term balance. The extremes of this debate. For some people, whatever you do will never be enough. For others, whatever you do will be too much. There is a sensible, balanced approach to emissions reduction, adopting new technologies, and that's what the Morrison government is focused on.
Andrew, there's no sense, Scott Morrison's going to come out mid-year and go, all right, we're going to 40%, but he might have some announcements in the climate area that you've alluded to. I guess the question is, if there's pushback even from within his party about those announcements, let's say there's another $5 billion fund for whatever it might be, does he still have that authority? This wasn't very long ago, this election, to ignore people such as, George Christensen, Barnaby Joyce, Craig Kelly, whomever it might be. Can he put up with a few dissenters and roll out with the policy? I mean, the Liberal Party's, meant to be able to disagree about things as long as you've got the majority on side?
Yeah, I think so, and it's quite clear, even the names you mention, the difficulty's more with the Nationals than the Liberals, and that's where he's going to have real difficulty. I guess in doing it, he has to placate them on issues such as coal as well. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I mean, I thought Josh Frydenberg summed it up pretty well there.
they're under attack from both sides of the argument. And, you know, it is kind of the third rail of Australian politics. So I guess the Royal Commission people are saying could be a reason to say we've had someone independent look at it and this is what they recommend. One MP did make the point to me, very important point, which Scott Morrison kind of keeps making, that if China and India don't do anything, so what if we do something? Now, the argument, of course, is if we show leadership that others might be more inclined to reduce their emissions. And, you know, I see some point to that argument. But the real fear is that unless you can convince those two major powers to reduce their emissions, we're just going to have to put up with the weather we're putting up with.
Well, that will happen regardless. There's going to be, you know, that's the concern years of this heightened bushfire threat. The hope will be that it doesn't get even worse in future years. But yes, it's a problem that's not going away given the failure at the last COP conference. So it's a fair point to make. Andrew Clennell, Political Editor, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.